Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our podcast with the Center for Asian American Christianity. My name is Dr. David Chao, and I have the privilege and delight to host a second part of our conversation with Nate Samayo, who is in Guam. So, Nate, do you want to just reintroduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, David, for having me. It's really nice to be in this space. Yeah, my name is Nathan Samayo. I'm going into my second year in the Religion and Society program at Princeton Theological Seminary's PhD. And I'm currently in Guam, so I've
That's
been here.
awesome.
Yeah, currently I've been in Guam for about 2 months, and I'll be returning back to the States in a couple of days. So, yeah, that's what's going on right now.
That's great. That's great, Nate. And I know from the first part of our podcast conversation, this trip to Guam is part of your dissertation research as
Mhm.
a scholar, but it's also a highly personal
So,
uh, trip journey for you because Guam is where your family's at, it's where you grew up. And so, with this second part of our podcast, I want to continue the narrative of both on the research side, but also on the personal side. So maybe the first kind of bucket for us to talk about is just tell us what you've been up to since the last time we've spoken. What are some things you've seen, and what are some things you've done?
Absolutely. Thanks for that question. And I'm in Guam, so the network, it says right here that the network is struggling. So if I'm in and out, please feel free to follow up with what I left off with.
That's fine. I hear you good though. I hear you very clearly though.
Awesome. So yeah, I mean, we talked, I think a week after I arrived to Guam. And at that point, I was just situating a meeting with the new team that I was working with, which I would love to talk more about, and then also seeing my family. Um, and now I'm at the tail end of things. I've been here for about 2 months. And in terms of updates, I started my work with an awesome organization. I mean, they're doing trailblazing work here in Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, which includes also the islands of Saipan, Luta slash Rota, and Tinian. So that conglomerate of islands is called the Mariana Islands, and then some folks from Guam would say Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, which include those three other islands. And the group is called the Micronesian Climate Change Alliance. And so they do a lot of work around land stewardship, but also reconnection of the indigenous people here in Guam back to the land through different practices, including um, weaving, storytelling, oral history, um, and even this practice that they do yearly called Amit walks. Amit, which means traditional medicine in the Chamorro language, and so they do these walks through the jungle, through the different islands that reconnect people to natural medicines here in Guam and Northern Mariana Islands. I'm trying to get the diasporic Chamorros. So that's what we kind of call the Chamorros who don't live or didn't grow up in Guam. We call them the diaspora Chamorros. And hopefully the goal is that we get diasporic Chamorros to come back to Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands to go on these Amit walks. So these medicine walks. So basically it's like a healing journey back home. So I worked with the Micronesian Climate Change Alliance, which is those are, they're family now. I'm so happy to do work with them in the future. And we launched an exhibit at the Guam Museum that's going to be up for several months. And the exhibit is called Tanai and Nimu. So Tanai and Nimu meaning to give your entire spirit. And it's this exhibit. Yeah, so Tanai and Nimu, I'll spell that out also in the chat and give a link. Um, But yeah, to give your entire spirit, that's how you would say it in Chamorro. And the whole exhibit is based on land stewardship and land rights. And it was a gorgeous exhibit. They had over 30 artists from all over the Chamorro diaspora, um, people from Fiji, people from Turtle Island. They all had artwork inside the exhibit. There was live art also. There was a fashion show. So I would love to point folks to go check that out online. So it'll be up until October. Different schools are bringing their students over to go look at the exhibit to learn more about land rights. Yeah, it was a beautiful exhibit, and you can tell there was a lot of work put into it. So the launch was on July 13th. So I spent kind of half of my time working with Micronesian Climate Change Alliance, all the way down to painting the walls of the exhibit, right? Um, when they launched. And then I'm kind of doing like a slight transfer. So there is this amazing organization in Guam called SKC, which stands for Sagan Katoan Chamorro. So that's the name of the organization, Sagan Katoan Chamorro. And right now they have this amazing exhibit, or not exhibit, but museum of, we call them ancestors, but other folks will call them artifacts. So different artifacts of the history of Guam, from the pre-Ladi era, which these are historical time marks that I'm still learning about, but from the pre-Ladi era to the Ladi era to the modern era. So Ladi, yeah, how do I go about explaining this? They're just historical epochs, because people have occupied Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands for about 4,000 years now, coming from what is called um, Sulawesi, which is kind of man, I'm getting the geography a little mixed up, but it's Southeast Asia. And 4,000 years ago, they made their way to Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands. And so those three historical epochs kind of mark the historical epochs of Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. And this museum that I'm working at has ancestors slash artifacts from all three eras. So I'm kind of working with them, hopefully, to catalog the oral histories of all these artifacts. Uh,
Yeah, I wanted to just um, pause a little bit on the notion of ancestors
sure,
as exchangeable with the concept of artifacts,
absolutely.
because I'm not a museum curator,
Yeah,
but when I think about artifacts within an enclosed glass case of a museum exhibit, I think of things. When I
absolutely.
think of ancestors, I think of people. Say more about how fluid this boundary is between ancestors and artifacts.
Absolutely, man. This is gonna get, and everyone has different philosophies about this, right? Around the lamb being the ancestor. I mean, within the Chamorro kind of creation narrative, yeah. So the lamb being the ancestor, right? The Chamorro narrative of Fuunas and Puntan, which is the creation narrative of, if I'm correct, for Guam, I'm not sure what the creation narrative for the other islands in the Mariana Islands, including Saipan, etc. But for Guam, different people tell the narrative of the creation of Guam. One of the narratives, in terms of Fuunas and Puntan, who were quote unquote the brother and sister who made the world, right? So the sister Fuuna made the world, out of the brother Puntan, out of his body. And then after she created the world, she curled over and turned into a rock. And there's a rock called Fuuna Rock. And when the sand danced on Fuuna's back, it created the first Chamorro. That's one of the creation narratives of Guam. And it's been integrated within Catholic creation narratives as well, which I'm still learning more about. This is what some folks might call syncretism, right? Different kind of worldviews and religions kind of synchronizing for, to birth maybe new phenomena or new religious experiences. All that to say, the point of the story is that the people of Guam are told the creation narrative is that we come from the land. And so, with all these artifacts in the museum that are made from the earth, right, we would call that our ancestor. Um, and I learned from a Kanaka Maoli teacher. So, Kanaka Maoli meaning Native Hawaiian teacher, we Hawaiians would call the kumu, which it means like teacher or person with like wisdom in Hawaiian. And he said it's as simple as when you say you are what you eat, right? You are what you eat from the land, right? And when even I guess I don't know how folks would take this, but you know, within the Christian narrative, right? You are born from ashes, and to ash you should return. you are a part of the earth, right? And so shouldn't we also call the earth our ancestor in that kind of way, right? And so when I use, go ahead, yeah, please, David,
No,
yeah.
that is a really rich and textured reflection about creation. I think it admits for much deeper probing from a Christian perspective or a biblical narrative. And you've already referenced the doctrine of creation. Um, but I am also cognizant that I interrupted you as you were narrating the SKC Museum
Sure.
and your development of these oral history interviews. So please continue with describing the things. We can pick up these themes because of ancestor and land because I'm very interested in it, but I didn't want to sidetrack you too much.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I was just kind of wrapping it up with this point here, right? And so, um, yeah, I'm trying to be mindful of the language around artifacts. It carries this kind of, anthropological, very orientalist sometimes of like, oh, these people's histories and cultures are fixed and static in history, and you can put them in a museum, showcase, and tell this is what an authentic, pure indigenous person's life was in this moment of time, as if indigenous people also didn't, their culture didn't transform with modernity. That's one of the main arguments that I'm kind of pushing. All that to say, just to finish up with what I'm doing right now. Right now, I'm working with the awesome families who have put this organization together called Sagan Couture and Chamorro. I'm working specifically with the curator to just document these histories that are existing through oral history. But we would love to, write these on paper and have this available to the community in Guam and also for the diasporic Chamorro people. And just to note, Chamorro being the indigenous people of Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. We want these histories available for when people want to come back home and visit and learn more about their history. So yeah, right now where we're at is when I come back to Guam, helping out at the SKC Museum, just really cataloging and documenting the history of these ancestors slash artifacts. So that's where I'm at right now, and that's going to be a long term project, hopefully for the next couple of years.
Wow, it sounds like the last 2 months have been incredibly fruitful with the Micronesian Climate Change Alliance,
Mm-hmm.
the SKC. These are institutions with networks of people and shared interests to
Mm-hmm.
highlight the relationship of indigenous people with their ancestor lands.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really rich, I guess, journey trip that you've been on. Thank you for describing and sharing with us what you've seen and learned. And what kind of hits me is you're really digging deep into some basic issues of land stewardship
Absolutely.
and kind of the natural environment and this very symbiotic relationship with human creatures
Mm-hmm.
and the natural creation, to use kind
Absolutely.
of Christian doctrinal language. That's really fascinating. Let's peel this back a little bit.
Great.
You already began sharing some of the arguments for your research that you were wanting to make, but even before then, help us get into some of your interpretation and analysis. So you're working with this alliance, you're working with museums, you're wanting to create an archive of oral history interviews. Those are the things you're doing.
Yeah.
What are the things you're thinking about as you're
Absolutely.
doing these things?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this has a lot of stakes in terms of how I'm reflecting on these experiences, even down to the level of my dissertation, what I'll be planning on writing on. So maybe I can start with that, Um, and what I was originally thinking about. So I'm in the Religion and Society program at PTS, and there's a lot of different things you can do with it, right? You can go a historical route, you can go like in the realm of ethics. Um, so for me, I was looking at indigenous religion and land stewardship. And a lot of it, within the context of Guam, has to do with the ways in which, the military occupies 33% of the land in Guam. Um, And Guam serves as a very strategic, the U.S. consciousness and in the East Asian consciousness, political consciousness, in terms of having a good footing into the Western Pacific. So Guam is, very significant to Pacific Rim geopolitics, is what I call it. And so I was gonna write on the indigenous activist groups who are fighting for land back and land stewardship from the occupation of the U.S. military. Now I was thinking about it, and I think one of the struggles right now, especially right being in the academy, is that we're very trained to have sharp critiques, right? We're very trained to critique, and I was talking to one of my professors from undergrad, and they were like, yeah, being in the academy, it's all about being clever. It's all about creating a clever theory. Um, and I was thinking about it, and I was like, at some point, dude, like, when are we done talking about empire? Not that it's not happening, but the fact that we have a gazillion critiques about empire. But the question for me, which I would love to talk about, is the question I've been asking is, how do you transition out of empire? That's the question for me. And, there's not a lot of texts out there. There are, I'm not going to dismiss all the texts that talk about, some people would call it after empire studies. There are all these post deep, everything. You want to add a hyphen on everything. But for me, it's like, okay, we understand that Guam's a U.S. empire, part of the U.S. empire, and the endured centuries of colonialism, starting from the Spanish. But my question becomes like, okay, great. So how do you transition out of the empire? Does anybody actually have a vision for how we ought to live, not only physically out of the empire, but not being any more indoctrinated by capitalist and imperial logics, right? How do we live outside of the desire to extract or the desire to accumulate? Like, how do we affect that change to the psychological level? And I'll wrap up this TED talk now that I could go on. But basically, what I've been learning is I've been hanging out and spending a lot of the times with weavers, so people who were doing traditional weaving techniques, people who were printmaking different icons and symbols within Chamorro culture throughout Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, and Luta slash Rota, Saipan, and Tinian. And I've been learning from being around people who carve, so master carvers who make jewelry. The most important one being called a sanahi, which is made out of a spondylus seashell here in Guam. And these people are very mindful that Guam is a U.S. colony. There's no question about it. But that aspect of Guam being a US colony and wanting to seek a life outside of that has already informed their practices. I mean, the basic practice is, where are you going to get your materials for this cultural material that you're making, right? Whether you're weaving or making jewelry, the question is, where do you go on the island to be able to get your materials? And even that practice of knowing land to the intimate level of when to pick things in season, right? Where to get certain seashells at certain parts of the island. These are practices that make you reground yourself to land. And so now what I'm interested is, how do these practices allow us to be one with the land, one with the natural, moving with the natural seasons. Some people would call that relationality, right? How do you synchronize yourself with the land's natural movements? And I'm kind of speaking in philosophical terms, so I'm hoping we can unpack this. But I kind of shifted my interest not to only talking about land back within a decolonial framework, right? I think that work is being done. But I'm interested in, how do we re reground ourselves to the land, for to create practices that are sustainable. And so I'm interested in what these artists are doing in terms of, how do we make their practices more structural, so that people become more familiar with the land that they live on, so that hopefully they no longer desire extraction or no longer desire accumulation. um and that's where I'm headed now with my dissertation. It's kind of away from an analysis of empire, even though that's informing my work, but more so towards practices that are sustainable for the earth. That sounds kind of heady, so I'm happy to talk more about
Absolutely,
that.
absolutely, absolutely. I'm tracking very substantively with all the major claims you're making. So I'll offer some kind of, we can go back and forth for a while here
Please.
because there's a lot of stuff coming to my mind that's very fruitful for conversation. Um, on the bigger point, here's my take. It
Sure.
sounds like your interest in history and archives
Mhm.
serves the end of liberation. All right. So,
Yeah.
and there's a distinction here because sources only is, it's kind of like you're not interested in history for history's sake.
Yeah.
You're interested in history for the political end of liberation, right?
Which
So
is a hot take for historians, because some folks.
yeah, no, this is kind of a an intramural discussion with historians how they understand what they take themselves to be doing,
Mhm.
especially in areas of Asian American history, which came out
Absolutely.
of ethnic studies, which was part of the Asian American movement
Yeah.
spawned by the Third World Liberation
Yeah.
Front, which was explicitly about political economic liberation, right? So the entire premise of ethnic studies was for liberation. It was never disinterested historical knowledge.
Absolutely.
So I think I see you as kind of located within that end of political liberation. This claim about going beyond analysis of empire, it makes me think. So we can, I want to track the resources that you're going to employ, and I can share at least one resource that is
Mhm.
proximate to this from the field of world Christianity.
Yeah.
And I hope we don't lose our audience here. This is, we're going to get into some nerd talk here, but Jehu Hanseal's Migration and the Making of Global Christianity, he bookends this project by basically, and this is my paraphrase, that
Mhm.
um, analysis of empire can overdetermine the narratives we tell about world Christianity. That's my paraphrase,
Oh,
and I
yeah.
won't go into the quotes. Um,
Yep.
so the concept of overdetermination is a very helpful way of framing it because we're not saying analysis of empire doesn't matter,
Yep.
but if we only situate the history of Guam and its people from a post imperial analysis, we can neglect a lot of what we then take as interesting stories. And I
Oh.
think about Viet Thanh Nguyen,
Mhm.
and there's a talk he gives about narrative scarcity
Yep.
and how when you're breaking out and trying to proliferate the stories of subaltern or marginalized communities, there's this initial in sort of the development of the discourse, there's an initial scarcity issue, which then takes on the burden of over representation. You're always looking for the perfect representation for the marginalized community, which is, that's just a recipe for disaster because you can't represent the diversity within just a few stories.
Absolutely.
And I think what the Center for Asian American Christianity is on about is narrative surplus. We want to proliferate the diversity of stories. And one way to do that is to identify the conceptual constraints and categorical binaries that kind of offer narrative constraint. So you're naming empire as the predominant form of power analysis
Yep.
is to say, okay, that's important, but
Yep.
that cannot predetermine or overdetermine the story you want to tell, which you take to be ingredient to the political end of liberation of Guam and its people.
Oof, David, you're going off now, man. Can I jump with that real quick? I mean, there's a couple things too, right? I mean, the first one is sometimes when people use like a or use empire as like a historical analytic to talk about a certain, geography or whatever. Sometimes the history isn't even that comprehensive, right? Because of the overdetermined nature of talking about empire. And people are gonna get on my head about this, but this is actually why I started to rethink Catholicism in Guam, right? And one of the main reasons, right, is so this was after the Spanish American War when Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam were handed over from the Spanish Empire to the U.S. Empire. And then there was this what they call like oh man, the insular cases, right, from 1898 to 1901, when they were trying to figure out the political status of these new subjects who are entered into the U.S. empire. And during, the year 1900, when the U.S. Navy was kind of the administrator of the island, they abolished Chamorro. You couldn't speak Chamorro in public schools. And beyond people who were working at the farms, working at the ranches, or even in the capital, who were speaking Chamorro, one of the places that was still speaking Chamorro was the Catholic Church, right? And they still spoke. The priests there were like, "Oh no, like we're speaking Chamorro. Like this is our space." And that's why, man, the old ancient Chamorro language is still very much embedded in Catholic hymns that have been like made into Chamorro, like our Chamorro hymns about the Catholic faith, and also the 9-day rosary. So in Guam, when someone dies, right, we do a 9-day prayer service starting the night that the person died for 9 days. It's a very Chamorro practice, right? And a lot of people don't like to admit that the 9-day rosary is a very old school Chamorro thing, man. I mean, the whole thing is prayed in Chamorro. And if you look at these old books, they're all written in the ancient Chamorro language, not even in the modern colloquial sense, but there's words in there that people don't even use nowadays. And they're very poetic, right? The way that I'm forgetting what the word that they use, but it's a word for family. And within these books, within these hymns, the word family means a woven mat. It describes the essence of, like, if you look at a woven mat that you sit on, like when you go to the beach, how
Mhm.
tight that woven mat is the word for
Mhm.
family. And these are written in old Catholic Chamorro hymns, man. Like, and so the Chamorro culture is embedded in these new practices of Catholicism. People didn't practice Catholicism until Spanish colonialism. So I'm rethinking the role of Catholicism within the ways that colonialism in Guam is talked about. So that's one of the
Absolutely.
ways that I hear what you mean on that, and that's kind of what I'm employing. The second one, man, you brought up a point. What? Oh man, it slipped my head, but I had two major points. One that you just said. Um, Dang it, it slipped my mind. All that to
That's fine.
say, yeah, I am rethinking the like Catholicism as an indigenous Chamorro religion because it has been
Yep.
indigenized in Guam. So that's something I'm
Yep.
thinking about when you say that.
I uh as another Asian Christian analog,
Hmm.
the story you've relayed about the retaining of Chamorro native language within the spaces of Catholicism is directly analogous to the retaining of Taiwanese language within the
Yep.
Presbyterian Church of Taiwan, in
Hmm.
which, in the early 20th century, under Japanese imperial rule, uh, part of what the Japanese Empire targeted on the island of Taiwan was the Taiwanese language. And so Japanization was the kind of imperial enforcement of Japanese culture upon the Taiwanese people, which then took center stage language use.
Hmm.
Presbyterian Church in Taiwan prioritize worship in the Presbyterian Church with the Taiwanese language.
Wow. Yeah.
After World War II, under KMT nationalist rule, when Chiang Kai shek brought the nationalist government from the mainland to Taiwan, and it was a military dictatorship,
Mhm.
white terror ensued. Um, the KMT enforced Mandarinization, which was it took specific form with respect to overruling the use of the Taiwanese language. So once again, under KMT national rule in Taiwan, the Taiwanese Presbyterian Church focused again on preserving and
Yep.
exercising their political agency
Yep.
in terms of Presbyterian worship in the Taiwanese language.
Yep.
So the importation of these Anglo European
Mhm.
Christendom forms
Yep.
of Christianity
Yep.
get very complicated when they
So,
get indigenized,
yep.
especially on the issue of language use. So
100%.
I think this is a very fruitful area of further research. And I'm very interested to learn how you will navigate these issues. I want to pivot back to three practices you mentioned. And this is back on the topic of the end of liberation. It's like,
Mhm.
okay, we've done our power analysis, it's ongoing, but what does this mean on the ground? How do we overcome or resist
So,
empire, so to speak?
yeah.
How do we enact forms of justice and solidarity in our day, in our here and now, so to
Yeah.
speak? And you mentioned weaving,
Mhm.
walking, and I'm thinking of the kind of
Mhm.
um,
Medicine
medicine
ball.
walk you
Yep.
mentioned, yeah, and then carving.
Yep.
So let's look at these as social practices
Yep.
that are indigenous,
Yeah.
that are also religious, let's say.
Mhm.
How do you envision weaving, walking, and carving as making a dent against empire?
Absolutely. I mean, the first question, right, that I think about are, and this is actually something I'm still learning, so I'm not putting too much kind of my position out there yet. But what's interesting is that the within the last, I would say, 40 years, and this is me having kind of subtle conversation with some of these artists, like climate change is changing up where you can even find these materials at, right? Not only climate, and somewhat folks will call that in kind of indirect, you know, intervention. I mean, the direct intervention, right, is that this is going on in the northern part of the island where the military is taking up more land that's becoming restricted from the what is it the local Chamorro people, where they can go into the jungle. And so in terms of going on these medicine walks, um, finding the materials needed for carving and for weaving, the first question you would ask is, where do you have access to resources, access to land? And already there, right, you're already having an imperial analysis involved, right? Where you're talking about rights to land, land that has been restricted. And that's what I mean by an imperial analysis is already, informing the way that you want to do these different practices. So in terms of that being that I would say is like the first prong in terms of how these practices already shape a kind of decolonial paradigm and onto something beyond that. Um Man, I'm trying to give like a concrete example. Um I guess just oh, okay, here's another one, right? So we were making these things called marmars. Some call it marmar. I think that's what they call it in Luta and Saipan. In Guam, we would call it a henton. And if folks watch Lilo and Stitch or Moana, it's the flower crown, right, around their head. And with those flower crowns, right, you would have to use tea leaves that you find in Guam. And those marmars, those hentons, they don't last very long. So you make it in season and you make it right before the festival or right before the big celebration. And you would use local plants, right? Here would be like an hibiscus or putitano blue. And even knowing where to pick these flowers, when these flowers are in season, these are ways to develop your consciousness towards the natural metabolic cycles of the land, right? And these practices happen everywhere. This is not just Guam, right? You have different plants that grow on different islands, right? Even on Turtle Island, you have different plants growing different places. I mean, people would read, Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and be able to learn the different cycles in which Robin's talking about. But these practices I don't know if the word is force, but they force you to understand the landscape in which you live in. And that's already radical. I mean, I don't know what plants grow in Princeton. I don't know the landscape out there, and it's because I'm in the library the whole time, right? And that's not to say I don't have an excuse, but it just shows. I mean, we kind of talked about this when we were talking about archives. Where is your archive, right? Where are your sources? And the fact that we always seek a global analysis, which is important, what I see as radical is knowing your relationship to the land that you're on, right? And in these practices of weaving, these practices of making marmar slash hentin, which is the flower crown, to the practice of making jewelry and carving out of spondylus shells. These are regrounding you to the rhythms of the land. And I find that very radical in a world where capitalism and race are constructed off of pulling people from the land that they call home. And that's one way of looking at race in terms of, I'm thinking of Willie Jennings when I speak of that. But like, yeah, so I'm thinking about this renewed relationship to land and the ways in which jewelry, weaving, and cart medicine walks help you reground yourself. Does that kind of answer the question?
It's a great response
Oh,
that
perfect.
these practices of weaving, walking, carving,
Hmm.
the kind of these practices spawn a renewed consciousness as
Yeah,
well as an imagination
yeah,
that cuts against the grain of the dominant imperial capitalist and militarization
hmm,
culture, right? So we're now talking when we talk about social practices, we're talking about culture and
yeah,
how culture is not politically neutral.
yeah,
There's some form of power that culture has within it,
yeah,
at least at the level of shaping how we think
absolutely,
about our relationships. And in
absolutely,
this case, the key relationship is the people and the land.
absolutely,
And rather than the commodification and instrumentalization of land for military and political ends solely, these practices cause us to imagine otherwise what our relationship with the land could be as an end in itself.
absolutely. Even in structural terms, right? I mean, this isn't just, I think people think of these practices as training you as an individual into a practice, right? Into becoming a master carver, master weaver. But when you start talking about not taking more than you need, those basic lessons, like I think sometimes we overcomplicate things, right? I love the lesson of the Kumu who from Hawaii, who told me when we were doing a panel over at the Smithsonian about indigenous religions in Oceania. He said it's as simple as you are what you eat. And back to the spam kind of um, irony that we talked about in the first episode, right? The overconsumption of spam in Chamorro diet is actually a reflection of the ways in which Chamorros were relying on U.S. Um, imported processed foods, right, and not anymore eating from the land, right. So these simple lessons of you are what you eat, don't take more than what you need. These are not only things you learn on an individual level in practice, but it's also about how to be in community on a structural level. And that's what I'm trying to lean into right now.
That's very profound. Let's pivot into the last bucket of our conversation. And I want to talk about the inward journey, your sort of personal existential journey, as far as you're comfortable sharing publicly on a
Absolutely.
podcast. Because I imagine if I were you,
Mhm.
that I'm firing on all cylinders conceptually, but this is also a passion project that impacts you existentially and personally.
Yeah.
So continue to share some of your thoughts and especially feelings
Sure.
as you're seeing, doing, learning, thinking.
Absolutely, man. Are we just gonna jump into concrete thoughts, man? I mean, I'm okay with sharing. Yeah, I'm okay with sharing personally if it's okay. I
Yeah.
want to give one example, right? The ways I've been, self conscious in the academy, this conversation of not being good enough, right? And a lot of it comes from, growing up, in a culture that some would say is not friendly to queer people, right? And that's specifically in my hometown, around my community. I'm not speaking for the entire Chamorro population and culture, but where I was at, right? Not being always having to be self-conscious about the way I present myself so I don't come off as feminine, right? As someone who identifies as a man. And being here in Guam, right? Not feeling good enough because I don't know all of these practices that my peers are doing. And I don't know the critical history of Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. But just the invitation to lay down the insecurity, lay down the anxiety, because it's not easy to come back home all the time, right? In any sense, it's not easy. And I'm lucky to be around a group of peers and mentors who have really been encouraging of me coming back to Guam, learning the history, dude, even down to learning the language because I forgot the language. I was in a hula group for 8 years and they taught us how to speak up until I was like 10 to 12. I'm forgetting. There was like a transition that I'm forgetting, but forgetting the language and coming back and folks speaking to me in Chamorro and not knowing what they're saying, right? And they've been like, you know how they like, the manunku, the old people here were talking, be like, "Hey, boy, it's okay, just try your best, and you're gonna get it. We only make fun of you because we love you, but we're poking fun at you because that's how we love you,
Mm,
um, and so even the invitation to drop my anxiety and my insecurities and learn, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not only about me, it's about me already knowing that I am enough and that my role is to contribute to the community that I'm in. So that's one concrete kind of personal thing, right? Now, David, can you repeat your question one more time? Because now I'm in
yeah,
my
no,
feelings.
I'll repeat it, but I also just want to say that to acknowledge and recognize that coming home oftentimes is not um, roses and unicorns, right? It's not always a happy feeling thing
Yeah,
because home has can have very complicated emotions attached to it. And
yeah,
I really appreciate your transparency and vulnerability to share how you're processing coming home emotionally as well
yep,
as just physically. And to
absolutely.
hear this and it's complicated by the intergenerational component,
Oh,
right? So
100%. Yeah,
because the older generation will have different norms at work that then complicate how they see home and your relationship to it from your perception of home and your relationship to it. And it's I'm glad to hear that there has been grace
oh, 100%.
extended, that there's been mutual recognition,
Yeah,
that the transition coming back home has been productive for you.
100%.
So the question again is simply to continue sharing how this journey has not been crossing, physical thousands of miles and traversing the physical geography and thinking through it on Guam, but also there's an emotional journey, a personal journey. So,
Absolutely.
if you have any other
Yeah.
stories about your personal journey that you're willing to talk about, that'd be great to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. I was meeting with a big teacher in Guam, right? I'm speaking in vague terms right now, but a well-known teacher in Guam, and we were talking about how it's important for folks to learn the language, the Chamorro, as in terms of like teaching people Chamorro culture. It's important to know the language, and it's important to know Chamorro history of Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. Now, the interesting thing that I told him was that it's also very important to come back home to learn Chamorro values. And I don't want to overstep how critical the values are. And let me give you an example. When I started at Harvard, we would have these work meetings and there would maybe be 8 to 10 people in the meeting, and when I walked in I would take 5 minutes of the meeting and go say hi to everybody, right? Acknowledge everybody's presence. Oh yeah. And here, that's the number. If you don't do that, oh, you're gonna get your butt beat when you get home, man, because you need to go acknowledge all your aunties and uncles, right? You need to go pay them respect. So the words respectu, which translate to respect, but basically, it's acknowledging everybody in the community, right? And when I was at these meetings at Harvard, man, like people would be like, dude, just sit down. Like you're wasting time. Like I don't even know these people that I'm meeting, right? But it's because you're getting down to business when you're over at Harvard. Well, I mean, some people think they're going down to business. Anyways, um, yeah, you're just supposed to go straight to business, right? Sometimes you don't even know these people's names that you're with. And it's very dehumanizing because it's like, dude, like we should know who we're sharing this space with. Um, and so I was talking to this teacher and I was like, it's very important to come back to Guam to immerse yourself in cultural values, because these are values that indigenous people have had that make them survive for thousands of years. And I don't think people get that, right? These old school values that people think are unnecessary is what kept indigenous people alive for thousands of years, right? When capitalism burned the world down in 500 years, you know? And so we need to put that into perspective, which is why I'm very interested in indigenous religion and um, ecological ethics, because it's what has kept indigenous people sustainable, right? And that's why I'm very interested in that part of my research. But all that to say, immersing myself in the cultural values, right, of even going around and acknowledging everybody, um, it's it's these things I took for granted because I would just grew up with them. And so I will say, in terms of the healing, the emotional aspect, the emotional kind of journey on this, re-immersing myself in very, traditional Chamorro values, um, has been one aspect. Man, I have one other thing, but I'm mindful that I just kind of talked a lot. I'll say it very quick. Whew. Okay, this is
Yeah.
going to be a little tough, right? Um, so
Okay.
I've been thinking a lot about protest and direct action. Now, the interesting thing here in Guam is that the stakes are very you. So in the U.S., the political stakes are very high for all kind of legislative decisions. Because of liberalism, it could be a lot more concealed behind the politics of diversity, equity, inclusion, representation at a very surface level, right? I could say a lot about this election coming up, but I won't do that at this moment. Um, but all the high stakes of U.S. politics can be concealed because of liberalism. Upward mobility, DEI, all that. Now in Guam, man, the stakes are very high also, but it's up in your face because your cousin and your uncle are the one who's pushing the legislation. And the hard part becomes when you want to go do a direct action and you're recognizing that you're holding a sign to someone who's your uncle. That is so hard for me, man, because there's only 160,000 people in Guam, and there's, a lot of population, Vietnamese, Filipino, who I'm not necessarily related to. So I know a lot of the Chamorros, right, in the government. And the other question is, I live in the diaspora. So the first question is, who the heck are you to come onto our island and try to tell us what to do because you don't even live here? And I'm just like, yeah, but my family was ripped away from Guam because of the military and what it did to my family. So it's like, how do you balance respect for the elders when, some of the elders are making decisions that you don't agree with on the political level that has stakes for everybody? That is tough. And so one of the most challenging things that I've had here in Guam is recognizing my place within the political system as being a diasporic Chamorro. I don't have an answer. But the longer that I spend here and serve the community, hopefully, I'll not that I want a spot at the table necessarily, but hopefully I can speak my mind on certain issues for what I think is right, you know? But it's different in the States when you're not related to the person making policy and you can go, block their house and pour blood all over their cars, and like scream in the middle of the night so they don't get sleep. It's easy to do that. But here in Guam, man, when it's your cousin and your uncle, it's like, where does that conversation have? Like, how do you have that convo? So that's one of the things that's actually been the hardest, being interested in the politics of Guam, of being a diasporic tomorrow.
I think I appreciate the specificity of the intra-family political difference. It sounds like there could be um, relatives who are, let's say, pro U.S. military base. Then there's folks, perhaps such as yourself, who are on the other side, but you're in the same family. So
Yeah,
then, how do you negotiate the direct political protest and activism, and then come home to a Sunday meal together and
100%.
not, not kill each other, so to speak,
Yep,
right?
absolutely.
Um, and I think there are variations on this within the broader Asian American family
Yeah,
context with things like national presidential elections,
yeah,
how the older generation may isolate on particular issues regarding communism in Asia, and how certain blue or red parties represent their position on that one issue that then kind of determines where they pull the lever on in November, versus the younger generation where that trauma under communism is not as live and they have other issues animating how they'll pull the lever come November. And I'm I think it's productive for us not to foreclose that conversation, right?
Absolutely.
And you resisted for the foreclosure of that conversation by saying, I need to understand how complicated this is.
Absolutely, and there's generations, right? I mean, even liberation in Guam. So, Guam's biggest holiday is called the Liberation Day, right? And it happens in July, and it's the liberation from Japanese imperialism in 1944 at the end of World War II, where they now activists would call it the reoccupation day because then the U.S. took Guam back. But man, there's generations of people who lived under Japanese occupation, and there was famine, right? Aganya, the capital, was destroyed after World War II. And there's people who live under the trauma of Japanese imperialism. And there's people who live under the trauma of US imperialism. And, how do you talk about it? It's in a way that respects people's lived experience of feeling liberated by the US from Japan. Or, folks would say being reoccupied by the US after Japan. How do you honor the histories of what the families went through? I mean, we can talk about that next time because it was brutal. I mean, down to mass genocides in the caves here in Yarahan, Maletsu, in those villages in the south, where, the Japanese threw bombs in there. And even the priests would, uh, run off with the communion so that they can serve the Chamorro people in the caves. These are real histories, right? And if we're going to honor our ancestors, we need to paint the full histories of their stories. Um, so I'm thinking about that too as you say that.
Yeah. This also, the real histories coupled with real violence
Sure.
that then traumatize real peoples
Yeah.
raises to the fore how mental health, so
Absolutely.
mental health is a very kind of
Sure.
clinical way to say this, but it gets into a discourse that is adjacent to this political conversation, which is the pains affect our actions and
Hmm.
our reasoning, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is in how a community addresses or doesn't address trauma, then
Absolutely.
impacts the community's ability to discuss, contest, negotiate in productive or non-productive ways, right?
Yeah.
So I
Absolutely.
think this is an area because I have a very significant mental health conference,
Yeah.
and we spend a lot of time talking about especially migration and racialization and the
Mhm.
trauma attached to this. And I think this last part of our conversation is directly related to that mental health piece.
Yeah.
Nate, I know it's late in Guam and we've come up close to an hour now. This has
Mhm.
been such a rich and textured conversation. I'm so glad to have caught you before your last few days here on Guam.
Mhm.
I hope we can do another podcast when you're back in Princeton
Yeah.
to kind of bookend these conversations. But really appreciative for your sharing your intellectual as well as personal journey this past summer in Guam, and really grateful for your sharing these sacred stories with us.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. I also want to offer my own thanks for this podcast being, the Center for Asian American Christianity and being able to share the narratives of Pacific Islanders. So, likewise, for the thank you. And I'm looking forward to our next conversation.